As Her Majesty's representative in County Antrim, it gives me great pleasure to speak to you today from the historic town of Carrickfergus on the 75th anniversary of Victory in Japan Day. Regrettably, we continue to find ourselves in uncertain times. However, we are fortunate with the powers of modern technology. It is wonderful to see the people of Mid and East Antrim and further afield still able to come together virtually to commemorate this historic anniversary of the end of the Second World War. 3 months have passed since we joined in the act of commemoration and thanksgiving for the victory in Europe. On the 15th of August 1945, His Majesty the King addressed the nation once again, and he spoke of how, and I quote, "We then rejoiced that peace had returned to Europe, but we knew that a strong and relentless enemy still remained to be conquered in Asia. None could then tell how long or how heavy would prove the struggle that still awaited us." Mercifully, the nation ended up coming together again in celebration relatively quickly. However, victory over Japan would come at a heavy price. Fighting in the Asia-Pacific conflict took place on a scale unseen in Europe. His Majesty the King said of the British and Commonwealth Fighting Force, the 14th Army, "They fought side by side with our allies and representatives of almost every unit in our great community. They fought in brotherhood. Through their courage and endurance, they conquered." The descendants of many of the Commonwealth veterans of that army are today part of the multicultural communities around the world, a lasting legacy to the success and comradeship of those who fought in the Asia-Pacific. As the commemorations continue in the coming days to mark the 75th anniversary of VJ Day, we pay tribute to the tens of thousands of service personnel from across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth who fought and died in the war against the Japanese. We must also remember the 140,000 prisoners of war who were held and suffered under the Japanese. It is important that they remain as part of the commemorations, and we thank them for their service and sacrifice. I'm pleased that some of the Mid and East Antrim veterans of the Second World War who were part of that valiant campaign will be featured later in this broadcast. Even today, we owe them a huge debt of gratitude for the sacrifices which they made and for their bravery in securing the victory over Japan, which brought an end to the war. His Majesty the King also said on this day in 1945, "So let us join in thanking Almighty God that war has ended throughout the world, and that in every country men may now turn their industry, skill and science to repairing its frightful devastation and to building prosperity and happiness." As we continue in the fight against COVID-19, those final words of His Majesty are as relevant today as they were then. May you stay safe and well, and may we always remember the sacrifices of those who laid down their lives for our freedom. God save the Queen.
As Mayor of Mid and East Antrim Borough, I'm honoured to invite you to join in our Council's contribution to the National Commemoration of Victory in Japan Day. Thank you to Her Majesty's Lord Lieutenant, Mr David McCorkle, for participating in this broadcast, and also to the veterans and their families for their contribution. This year is the 75th anniversary of the cessation of the Second World War in the Far East after 6 years of the world at war. We look back with humility and pride at the bravery and endurance of our armed forces on land, on the sea and in the air. We also remember the unstinting work of the Military Medical Corps and the Red Cross. Whilst VE Day marked the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, many thousands of armed forces personnel were still involved in fighting in the Far East until the surrender of Japan on the 15th of August 1945. The Western Allies, including the United States, had deployed in the Far East after war was declared on Japan in 1941. In December 1941, Japan had attacked British territories in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore and Burma, and by June 1942 the Japanese had driven British, Indian and Chinese forces out of Burma. After the surrender of Singapore, thousands of Allied servicemen became prisoners of war. From 1942, prisoners were forced under terrible conditions to build the Burma-Thailand Railway. British troops fighting the Japanese were also threatened by deadly and unfamiliar tropical diseases and extreme weather conditions. The war in Burma drew in troops from across the British Empire, and in 1943 the 14th Army was formed in India with the task to retake Burma from the Japanese. This most unique army was made up of soldiers from across the globe speaking more than 40 different languages and with all major world religions represented in its ranks. Unfortunately, the 14th Army is sometimes referred to as the Forgotten Army, compared to its compatriots in Europe. Yet it is incumbent on us to remember all of those who fought in the Burma campaign and won victory in Japan, bringing an end to the Second World War. It is very fitting that in November this year, Mid and East Antrim Borough Council will recognise our surviving Second World War veterans to mark the 75th anniversary of the end of the war. The veterans, including 3 veterans who served in the Far East in Burma and Singapore, will be presented with a specially commissioned silver poppy in recognition of their service during the Second World War. Let me share some of the stories of these 3 special men. David Finlay joined up in 1941 when he was just 18. He enlisted as a flight mechanic in the RAF, training for 2 years in England prior to overseas posting. In 1945, he was transferred to Ekyab in Burma, followed by Borneo and Singapore. In Singapore, he was tasked with bringing a message to General Montgomery, based in Raffles Hotel, to inform him that the Japanese generals had been captured and were being brought to Singapore by Sunderland flying boats. Nathaniel Thompson enlisted on 14th of December 1940 at the Royal Air Force Recruiting Office in Belfast. He had been living in Ballymacilroy, Randalstown at the time. He was called up in February 1941 and reported to Blackpool, where he learned Morse code. He went on to serve in the Royal Signals as a wireless operator and direction finding operator. He was also in the Y service, which intercepted enemy radio traffic. He travelled from Nuneaton, where he was training for Y service, to Liverpool, where he boarded a boat ship, the Duchess of Bedford, which sailed to join the convoy of about 50 ships on the River Clyde. The convoy left for the Far East on the 3rd of January 1943, travelling down the west coast of Ireland, stopping in North Africa, Sierra Leone, Cape Town and Bombay. He was based on Ekyab Island off the coast of Burma until the end of the war, bringing planes in as a radio operator. James Brennan served in the Second World War as a sergeant with the 8th Belfast Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment, the 22nd Battery. He was with the regiment during the Battle of Britain and the London Blitz. The regiment also served in France, and after his service in France, he was posted to Burma, where he served under Lord Mountbatten. In the closing years of the war, land forces were fighting the Japanese in Burma, while the Royal Navy's British Pacific Fleet took part in naval operations in the Pacific Ocean. In spring 1944, Japan launched an invasion of India, and from the summer of 1944, American heavy bomber aircraft based on captured Pacific islands had been able to strike Japanese cities. By summer 1945, these raids had destroyed large areas of Japan's major cities and caused enormous casualties. On the 6th of August 1945, the Japanese city of Hiroshima was hit by an atomic bomb. In the days following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and later on of Nagasaki, the Japanese government debated whether to surrender. On 15th of August, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Immediately, operations began to repatriate some of the 130,000 Allied prisoners held by Japanese troops in prisoner of war camps across the region. The RAF parachuted in 135 teams to negotiate the release of prisoners in Operation Mastiff, while Operation Birdcage saw 150 tons of leaflets dropped during 58 sorties. Food supplies and medical supplies were also dropped. In 1945, the end of the Second World War in the Far East was celebrated on VJ Day. that time there was much joy and celebration around the world when on the 15th of August 1945, the President of the United States, Harry Truman, declared the day as Victory over Japan Day at a White House press conference. President Truman announced that the Japanese government had agreed to comply in full with the Western Allies' Potsdam Declaration demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan.
As Deputy Mayor of Mid and East Antrim Borough, I'm honoured to take part in today's virtual commemorations to mark the 75th anniversary of the victory in Japan. This poignant day in history, when Japan finally surrendered, was announced in the United Kingdom by Prime Minister Clement Attlee in his end of war broadcast. He confirmed the news by saying, "Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemy is laid low. Peace has once again come to the world. Let us thank God for this great deliverance and his mercies. Long live the King." Later that day, King George VI addressed the nation and the Empire in a broadcast from his study at Buckingham Palace.
3 months have passed since I asked you to join with me in an act of thanksgiving for the defeat of Germany. We then rejoiced that peace had returned to Europe, but we knew that a strong and relentless enemy still remained to be conquered in Asia. No one could then tell how long or how heavy would prove the struggle that still awaited us. But Japan has surrendered. So let us join in thanking Almighty God that war has ended throughout the world.
Historic buildings all over London were floodlit and people crowded onto the streets of every town and city, singing, dancing, lighting bonfires and letting off fireworks. The special services of Thanksgiving were held in St Paul's Cathedral. Here in Northern Ireland, local people made the most of what was a 2-day national holiday to show their relief and thanksgiving at the end of the conflict. There was a VJ Day service of Thanksgiving at Belfast City Hall, which attracted large, cheering crowds when King George VI, in a speech over loudspeakers, pronounced that the war was finally over. Local newspapers in Mid and East Antrim reported in detail on the end of the war, as Thanksgiving services were held in local churches and celebratory parades were organised. A huge outdoor event was held at the town park in Larne on the 19th of August 1945, when over 8,000 people attended a United Church service. The address was given by Reverend Buchanan, who had been held by the Germans for some time as a prisoner of war. The parade, accompanied by 3 bands, included units from the Royal Navy, the Belgian Army, Sea Cadets, Army Cadets, Air Traffic Control, ex-servicemen, men and women from the Civil Defence and Nursing Services, the Women's Voluntary Services and numerous youth organisations. Celebratory victory dances were held in Ballymena and Carrickfergus Town Halls and Victoria Hall in Larne. There were also street parties for children, and victory parades and bonfires were lit across Mid and East Antrim, as local people celebrated the end of 6 long years of war. In Carrickfergus, a Belgian Army brass and reed band from Ballycarry paraded in the bunting-adorned streets, as the Belgian soldiers had also been granted a holiday for the occasion. The bonfires in Carrickfergus could be seen from the County Down coast, apparently enticing a crowd of merchant navy men to come ashore by motorboat to take part in the festivities. The signing of the actual Instrument of Surrender document took place on the 2nd of September 1945 on board the American battleship USS Missouri, which was moored in Tokyo Bay and was followed by the further surrender ceremonies across Japan's remaining holdings in the Pacific. Interestingly, the surrender ceremony of one of the Japanese garrison on the 6th of September 1945 has a link with the Port of Larne, as a photograph of the legal wording of the surrender document signed on board HMS Glory was presented to sea cadets by Lord Roden. He was president of Larne's Sea Cadet Corps, Unit 207 TS Glory, and had been sent a letter enclosing the photographs by Sir Anthony Vass Buzzard, commander of the light aircraft carrier, after the surrender was given at Rabaul off the Philippines. The documents are still held in Council's Larne Museum collection. The outbreak of war had in fact led to a new focus on Larne Port, which, with its short crossing to Scotland, was a vital transport hub. Over 4 million service personnel and 92,000 vehicles passed through the port during the war. Rail tracks ran onto the pier alongside the area where the ships berthed, permitting equipment to be transferred easily onto the railway. This branch of the railway line was nicknamed the Burma Road. Council's Mid Antrim Museum has a printed square of silk donated to its collection, showing the title page from the Nippon Times, 2nd of September 1945, after the Japanese surrender. It would have been purchased by a serving soldier as a souvenir. As Deputy Mayor of Mid and East Antrim, I hope you have enjoyed our tributes to those heroes who secured victory over Japan, bringing an end to the Second World War. We remember those who did not return, and the many whose lives were changed forever. We thank them for the sacrifices they made so that we can enjoy our freedoms today. Within my own extended family, we remember the service of Sandy Innes, my great-great-uncle, a sapper in the Royal Engineers, who was present at the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Norman Hughes, a great-uncle, initially of the Home Guard and then the Royal Irish Fusiliers, served in Egypt and Palestine. Although the Second World War ended 75 years ago, I believe the memories and testimony of men like Sandy and Norman will stand the test of time and serve as a living link between generations. We also look forward to November, when the surviving Mid and East Antrim veterans will each be presented with their silver poppy as a token of our recognition and thanks. Lest we forget.